Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Sofia Lemos. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at Reboca 2 and Suddenly It All Blossoms. And this evening, it's my pleasure welcoming performance studies scholar and curator André Lupecki to discuss the glossary word dance. André and I are conscious that we are speaking from a moment in time in which variable lockdown experiences, some of which are ongoing and others are of post-pandemic quote-unquote normality, have been simultaneously ruptured by the power of protest and by the seeding of a widespread collective consciousness and examination of structural racism in all its forms. These weeks have re-energized the need to grow already existing movements for more education, more aesthetic education, more kin, more community support, more tenderness, and more solidarity. We find ourselves facing a conservative assault, caught in a clash with governing and democratic forces and at the confluence of neoliberal, authoritarian, and neo-fascist ideologies that wish to dismantle the already precarious support structures for living and dying well that have been assembled by feminist, anti-racist, queer, and AIDS activism as well as environmental justice movements over the course of the last decades and century. Directly from Riga in the Baltic region, recent news reported Latvia joining Hungary and Poland in questioning the gender and pro-migration policy promoted by the European Union. In a world of globalized transits, of forced migration, and of willful movement, Andre's reflections today address how the management, surveillance, and control of movement has remained a central fact in this pandemic. He'll discuss what he calls the new general kinetics of power that commands both necropolitical, in other words, the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die, and biopolitical, that is, the administration of life and vitality as forms of social control made visible by the pandemic. Dear André, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this hour with you and to share your views with our viewers in Riga and elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for the biennial, for the invitation. Thank you also for the very generous introduction. So, as you said, Sophia, the original invitation was to be live and in person in Riga in September and have a conversation on the theme or the glossary word that you had chosen for me to talk about, which has to do with my work for many years around dance, both in dance studies, but also in dance dramaturgy and dance curating. And that word was dance. And of course, as you pointed out in your introduction, the situation in which we find ourselves over the past few months, and now particularly in the United States over the past couple of weeks since the murder of George Floyd, prompts a different kind of urgency in my desire to talk about that word, dance. So for this hour, I thought about rethinking a little bit my original ideas around what that lecture could be or that intervention could be. And I have to apologize both to you and to the viewers because these are very fresh thoughts, and in a sense they are frail, I guess conceptually, because they really enmeshed in the situation. And the situation is also, so for the viewers to understand, it has been my destiny, to use that very charged word, to be living and working over the past decade or more, 15 years or so, between Brazil and the United States, which means since 2016, 2017, to be operating under Trump and Bolsonaro. So, and it is within this kind of political condition and this kind of the kind of nervous system and the kind of body and embodiment that the life between these two conditions of neoliberal authoritarianism have precipitated in the Americas at large. It is from that position that I speak, and to that I feel it is important for the viewers to keep that in mind. All right, but what does it mean then to to still want to talk about dance at the moment in which we have a global pandemic that is unprecedented in its scale and velocity. And at the same time, the global pandemic happens in a moment, as you just pointed out, of a recrudescence of authoritarianism that does not even hide, in the West, in Western democracies, that doesn't even hide its kind of fascination, if not open embrace with fascist ideology and symbols. So is it still possible to talk about dance? Is it desirable to talk about dance at this point? And I'd say that it is important to keep talking about dance because as Randy Martin, who's a former colleague, he passed away a few years ago at NYU, a sociologist, a thinker of the relationships between Marxism and Marxist theory with mobilization. Randy Martin wrote an incredible book in the 90s called Critical Moves, in which he pointed out that if a political theory in the West has been informed by the relationship between the individual and the collective, mediated through the word action, it is the dancer, perhaps, who can understand how is it that action is embodied, mobilized, and set into a kind of representation and rehearsal of other possibilities for existing. So Randy would see dance, particularly experimental dance, and particularly experimental dance that has an emphasis on collective experimentation as a kind of rehearsal, ongoing permanent rehearsal for other modes of acting. And that the dancer then, or the mover, would have a kind of intimate knowledge, an embodied knowledge of what it means to mobilize. So I guess like one of the things that maybe you could talk about today, and for full disclosure, I sent to Sophia a text that is really long, full of, 30 different paragraphs on how to imagine the current condition of mobilization and mobility in the pandemic. I guess like one of the aspects that I'd like to bring to our conversation is how is it that movement remains central in the discourses that have been produced around the pandemic. It is, I don't know how it has happened in different countries and different regions have had different semantic, let's say, fluctuations and poetics around how to call the ethical obligation to remain sheltered. But the option by the state where I live in New York State, there was a kind of a small battle between the mayor of New York City and the governor of New York State and the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, which is a federal agency in the United States, whether the requirement for the population to stay in their homes in order to prevent the spread of the virus should be called lockdown, or should be called sheltering, should be called something. And then the state, the New York State, decided to call there's a pause, there's a pausing. And pause is a very aesthetic term, particularly in dance, in music, in poetry. It leads to a kind of suspension. It diffuses the kind of state of emergency semantics of a lockdown. It also the kind of carceral or prisonal semantics that lockdown also has. So we are all put in a state of suspension and pause. And New York now is coming out of the pause. New York State and New York City soon will be coming out of that state of pausing. And in that pause, I was talking to a colleague here in Brazil, a theater director and also a philosopher that I admire a lot. His name is José Fernando Azevedo. And we were talking a similar kind of public conversation the other day. And José is in São Paulo, and he said something like, I don't feel I've been paused at all. I feel like in the pause, what we understand and discover is a hyperactivity of governance and governmentality. It's a hyperactivity of police, and it's a hyperactivity of the essential laborers to keep the basic functions of living in place. Basically, the people who are working in the food industry, the medical industry, and the police. And meanwhile, in the lockdown, in that supposed pause, what is happening is a hyperactivity. But it's a hyperactivity that doesn't have the spectacle of displacement that we are used to in the urban, contemporary, modern representation of open democracies, right? Which is to have like this kind of bustling spectacle of the citizenry walking around in the streets or driving their cars, right? So activity and movement have been displaced. And in this displacement, there's a kind of tension that appears between what is the correct image of movement that this pandemic proposes to power, and what is it that it proposes to those who want to resist that power, right? And in that sense, I was thinking like how to tie all of this to a dance practice, just to be very, very close to the word. And I came back to a really interesting exercise, which is not really an exercise. It's both an exercise and in itself a kind of dance, or a dance that Steve Paxton, who was one of the co-founders of the contact improvisation movement in the 70s, along with Lisa Nelson and Nancy Stark-Smith and many others. But Steve Paxton developed this practice that he called the stand. He calls it also a small dance. And it's basically a very simple proposition that every single one of us could make, which is just to stand up, close our eyes, and be there. And be there as much as you can in the condition of being in a stand position. And what Steve actually brings to the conversation through the stand is that the dancer discovers that what is supposed to be an abolition or a negation of movement, it's actually a flourishing of micro movements and an activation of micro perceptions, which perhaps could then be the condition of possibility to start a different kind of affective hapticality between the dancer and the collective. Because the stand is a preparation for contact improvisation. The stand is a preparation for being a collective, right? And in that preparation, what takes place is a different kind of image of dance. It's a dance in which what is important, it's not necessarily the emphatic display of bodies displacing in a space-time continuum, but actually the presentation of bodies operating at the level of intensifying that stillness, right? And demonstrating that the stillness is not only a preparatory moment for the movement to come, but is itself a presentation of movement under different terms. And this is exactly like what I feel the pandemic allows us to start thinking about what is at stake here. Because obviously for neoliberal capitalism, the desire for bodies to be still has always been in place somehow. It is very important that in the kind of optical capitalism that we live through the 24/7 internet interface, right? That we're actually using right now for our conversation. It is very important that either bodies are still, I mean, in their homes or watching and buying whatever is available through the internet, on Amazon or whatever, watching Netflix 24/7, reading books, accessing others through Facebook or whatever, other platforms. But it's also like important that once those bodies are not in their home, that they are traceable and trackable, right, through our cellular phones. So regardless of what happens, what is important for neoliberalism is to understand and capture movement within the logics of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have called recently logisticality. Right? It is the condition of neoliberal capitalism to enforce, on one hand, a kineticism in the lines of production. So there's still going to be manual labor, and there's still going to be mechanical labor through technology to create the commodities that we use. And at the same time, it is important that neoliberal capitalism knows exactly where we stand. But that standing is precisely what the anti-small dance of Steve Paxton. It is a standing that is constantly feeding us a kind of set of kinetic propositions which are located in our fingertips so that we can swipe and click. And so this is the kinetic, basically the kinetic range of movement. And effectively, it proposes reflexive and reactive, a reflexive and reactive individual without any time of any kind of time to really ponder, right? So it's like on the political level, we see this kind of acceleration of postings and for quick reaction, in which the individual reacts quickly. And from the side of capital, we see reflective advertising so that you can quickly have impulsive buying kind of thing. And all of this is predicated on either standing or being tracked. And when I feel, Sophia, that something that has become, so I was really like, as I guess many of us, in the confinement, doing the ethical thing to stay at home so that others, so we don't become vectors for the disease, right? So that we can control and respect life, control the pandemic and respect the life of others. I was feeling like completely depressed, absolutely, even though like it was the right thing to do. And the reason I was feeling depressed is because, and that's why it had been so hard to talk about these moments. And you're gonna call me mad. I'm just finished right now because I know you also have this first introduction, because you have many super questions that you sent to me. It'll be important to go to these other aspects. But I just end like this first introduction, like why dance, why the stand, like because I could not help but to feel slightly mad, and mad in the sense of delirious, not because I was enraged, but in the sense of being slightly delirious, because I could not help to think that was a very, I don't want to sound paranoid, but I will sound paranoid. There's a very disturbing resonance between the pandemic and the pandemonium that has been created by Trump and Bolsonaro in the body politic of the Americas. And, you know, maybe the same is happening in Europe, as you just mentioned, in Latvia, I believe, and, you know, and Hungary, as we know, and other places. And I could have like these two, there's a kind of resonance. And I know that there's a kind of resonance, and the resonance has to do precisely with how is it that the pandemic forces movement, and how is it that neoliberal, neo-authoritarian, neo-fascism forces also movement. And I was feeling really like I didn't know what to do, and my students. And then all of a sudden, in the pandemic, as the militarized police remains the only ones who can circulate with impunity, we see yet another egregious event in the necropolitical project, this kind of necropathology that is the United States of America, to enforce yet another killing of yet another Black life, right? George Floyd's killing a few weeks ago. And what was remarkable, and it has been called out like by some founding members of the Black Lives Matters movement, that what changed right now, Angela Davis was saying the other day that this has been like an unprecedented mobilization of public outrage in the United States, right? The demonstrations over the past few days and a few weeks. And that was actually gives hope is that in the sheltering, in the confinement, despite the efforts of neoliberal, neo-fascist, 24/7, optic capitalism, there has been reflection, I think. And there has been really an accumulation of potentiality through the small dances that, despite the horror unemployment rates, despite the hardship, despite the death and the pain and the egregious response from the federal government and many other states in the United States, despite all of this, there has been something that happened at the kinetic level that opened up maybe the possibility for a real reflection of what is it that this compulsion to mobility that neoliberal capitalism brings to us has actually in the suspension brought us to. And here I just quote this really interesting interview, and I'll finish these first opening remarks, if I can find it here, in which one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matters movement gave an interview for the New Yorker not too long ago. And I'm trying to find that. Yes, it's Opal Tometi, who said in an interview to the New Yorker magazine, Opal said, "My view of these protests is that they are different because they are marked by a period that has been deeply personal to millions of Americans and residents of the United States, and that has them more tender or sensitive to what is going on. People who would normally have been at work now have the time to go to the protests, right? Or a rally. And they have time to think about why they have been struggling so much. And they are thinking. But what I'd like to propose to Opal is that, if I could, is that when we say time, we're saying movement. And when we're saying a kind of relationship to movement, right? The time to think is the pause to think, right? So, and that pause to be diagnosed by Opal Tometi as a kind of possibility of augmentation of sensibility and augmentation of the conditions to understand how is it that we're standing here in this historical moment right now. It's exactly Steve Paxton language when he says, once we do the small dance, we're not becoming individuals, we are becoming filters for the real, right? So this have been like my first, but I would have to say, if I had to say something about dance right now, specifically dance, this would be my first stab at it.
Andre, and right, so this idea of dance as the rhythm of everyday scenes that form part of a larger political choreography or choreographies is a tentative definition of dance that we never imagined would have become so timely. As I hear you, I'm reminded of your work on slowness as the amplification of the intensities and velocities of being, which recently was quoted by the brilliant Black Studies scholar Tina Kempt, who used it to refer or to think about the amplitude of the protests and the current experience of stillness and of slowness that it amplifies. So similarly to the quote you just read, the injustices perpetrated against Black lives. What is it in the choreopandemia that differs from or adds to your earlier work on slowness?
Yes, it's really an honor to be to have my work be in resonance with Tina's work. So it's interesting because when I first came into dance, I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, and I was just working in Lisbon at the time with a bunch of friends, and they became choreographers and musicians, and what was interesting in the late 80s was that both for dance practice and for dance scholarship, there was a real high anxiety in relationship to slowness and stillness. And somehow the movement that happened in the late 80s throughout the 90s in many of the experimental choreographers that I worked with, but many, many others, was actually this critique of the imperative to move, this imperative for mobilization as a kind of ongoing spectacle of the porno-pharmaco capitalism that Preciado talks about, or this kind of neoliberal logistical impetus for ongoing mobilization, right? So there was that critique going on, this critique of the imperative for the properly constituted subject of the nation state to be to model him or herself out of an image of a self-propelled movement, individual, self-propelled individual. Peter Sloterdijk was also useful in a book in the 80s when he talks about the relationship between modernity and what he calls the automobile as a theological and as an onto-theological entity for understanding the industrialization modes of modernity, right? In which every individual has to have a car, and has a fascination by this delusion that by having a car I can move myself. It's myself moving. So all of that critique is part of this ongoing critique, not only of neoliberalism but also of the liberal capitalism project of white expansionism, European expansionism, all of that. But when I think the question of slowness brings to the neoliberal moment, I think has been expressed in a really beautiful dance that doesn't look like a dance, but it's a dance, and it's presented as a dance, which is a project, a piece by David Weber Krebs that I think was premiered maybe 2017. I don't have it right now. It's 2017, I believe, called The Guardians of Sleep. And what happens in that piece? It's explicitly David Weber Krebs wants to create a critique of the 24/7 capitalism and this kind of empire of light, this kind of enlightenment project of both individuation and aesthetic white supremacy kind of thing that is then harnessed by the 24/7 industry, so that, as in the words of Silicon Valley, eyeballs are captured, right? So how is it that then a non-human element like photons are actually harnessed by expansion and extractive capitalism to extract more from us, right? To capture our capacity to consume. But what I think David Krebs, so what he does in that piece is really interesting. So he the way I saw it at the Kai Theater in the Kai Studios in Brussels. So it's like a small space that he prepared for a small number of audience. It's basically 6 or 7 performers. Each of them have 5 or 6 audience members around, so not that many, maybe 30, 35 people in the room. And we start by gathering around a dancer who holds an iPad, and the dancer is just going through the iPad and showing pictures of their last 12 hours, like what happened over the past. And it's pictures of everything, absolutely everything whatsoever they can imagine. And we with them, and we start seeing like how is it that reality becomes captured by these machines. But the things like as they go along, they increase the speed, the velocity in which they show images. And after a while, we're just like, I started almost puking because the vertigo of images that are being produced, and those we know are just like a tiny fragment, and the acceleration of this, the availability of the images was just like, and then you realize that all of them fall into a rhythm and they're all saying the same thing, all the dancers, because in different classes. And then all of a sudden they left us alone, the audience. We were sitting like in along a long wall, right? In kind of steps that are covered by a kind of soft blue carpet. And the dancers leave us and they go to the floor and they become absolutely, completely immobile. Completely, right? And that's it. And so we've been like 10 minutes on this crazy image, and all of a sudden there's nothing, except their presence, absolutely immobile, lying on the floor with their eyes open. And as they have their eyes open, you see like the eyes just moving, right? And there's nothing else, and there's silence. There's no soundtrack. And then the lights start to go down very, very, very slowly. It's a 30-minute fade out. Okay? So what happens then? And I think this is really, really beautiful. Okay? And this is like the displacement between, I would say, like the late 1990s, early 2000s critique of mobility through stillness and slowness that happens throughout the 90s that I was talking about, and the new kind of understanding of slowness in a move that goes from the kinetic to the affective. Okay, so what happens to the audience? What happens to every audience that has nothing to see in front of them, and they are exhausted by being the neoliberal subject of production in a European metropole. All of a sudden you're there and you're like, you start listening to snoring sounds because someone next to you just fell asleep. Because we're not sitting, we can actually lay down because it's right. And then another one starts to fall asleep, and then people start snoring, and then you hear this, like the sounds that the stomach or the intestines make, very like right. All of these start to come up, right? Like there's a name actually for that, which I forget right now. There's a beautiful piece. Okay, anyway, so this sounds. So what happens at that moment is that David Weber Krebs and his dancers were able to produce another kind of mode for humans to exist, which is the herd. We are herd. We are mammals at that point. We are no longer spectators. We're not emancipated spectators. We're not critical forces of the kinetic imperative. We're just mammals snoring and making weird sounds because of the amount of gas that we produce in our insides, right? So this, for me, is a really interesting understanding of slowness. And then what happens after is like we go to an almost blackout, and then it comes back again, and then they get up, and then we leave in this kind of state of perplexity. But for me, like this kind of choreographic understanding of slowness, because that's what happened, is that if we really push us further through the pause and through the slowness, deep into the flesh, and we stop being body, like Hortense Spiller's distinction between body and flesh, right? we stop being bodies, which are the kind of organized modes in which different kinds of powers, organize and anatomize our subjectivities and corporealities, to go to the flesh, right? So once we become flesh, and once we present the flesh, as Alexander Weheli proposes in a beautiful, amazing book called Habeas Viscus, right? Instead of habeas corpus, habeas viscus, like the presentation. Here's the flesh, right? So once it's here's the flesh, then we have like a real choreographic critique of the subject. We go into the herd, we go into the mammalian beings that we are. And at that point, through slowness, there may be a critique, but not only a critique, I have to say it like an actualization of a critique that is corporeally felt of what Sylvia Wynter would have called, or has called, the ethnoclass called man, right? Which is the northern hemispheric white adult male hetero, so on and so forth, cis, all of that, like, and that subsumes itself as being the only representative of the category of the human. So my question is like, how can we be as slow as a cow would be really nice, or as slow as a plant, or so other regimes of slowness. I think this is what's maybe happening right now. Maybe, I don't know.
So following your argument, in the colonial modern liberal logics that export this particular definition of the human, also resides a view that assumes sustained movement, that presumes the ability to move, which both CRIP and disability study scholars have also shown. But you equally mentioned that one of the most acute conditions that was enhanced by the pandemic was this sort of Cartesian-like mind-body split, with our minds shuttling globally in between screens, free to probe the world, whilst our bodies remain confined. So to recap, why is the tangled dance between colonial, heteropatriarchal, and ableist neoliberal programs increasingly more difficult to grasp? And how is this grammar at the same time supporting the free election of undemocratic forces?
Sophia, that's the question, right? It's like that is the question. Okay, so when Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, his first speech was to say that now freedom was finally here. The same thing happened in Trump election, and the same thing we can see now when the pauses and shelter in place and lockdowns, whatever the names are used in different states and municipalities across the United States to call the need to stay at home and to practice social distancing. There was this right-wing counter-movement to claim freedom, right? Like I saw even a photograph, and it was in the New York Times, so I believe it's not fake news, of someone holding a placard saying selfish and proud, right? And therefore demonstrating without a mask and being outside. So the question that you're asking is like, how come freedom, right, is a word that can be so promising and at the same time so ugly, right? That's how I read your question. I understand your question. Because it was under that word that actually Bolsonaro, Trump, and many, many others have been elected, right? So the question then becomes, and I can only understand the ambiguity, the ugliness, and the promise of that word if I go, once again, if I read it or semanticize it through a logic of movement. Because this is the thing. Just to be short in a kind of master narrative, and I apologize for that, but the moment in which choreography appears as an operative word in the West, as a new art form that did not have necessarily that name, and that autonomizes itself as such, choreography appears in 1700 in France under the direct auspices of Louis XIV, right? It is a consolidation of a certain kind of logic of governance that, not coincidentally, requires the production and management of the movement of the individual. Those go hand in hand. There is no way to think about the formation of the state power that is no longer subsumed to the absolute will of God, but to the absolutist will of the sovereign, and at the same time the creation of this new art form, right? So there's that. And what is it that this art form creates? It understands that if there is a new logic for the state that is predicated on actions and motions of their subjects, the first role of the state is to ensure that those actions and movements of their subjects must be not only surveilled, but produced, so that the only repertoire of movement that I have as a subject is the repertoire that is produced and given to me by the state as my natural movements. Is this making sense? Okay, right? So there's this production of this movement, and this is given to the subject as their freedom. Something that is really, really interesting, and we need to think more about that, is how come in the West, right, the idea of freedom is ontologically, intrinsically fused and confused with the idea of freedom of movement. It's impossible to think about freedom without freedom of movement. And that's why when the pandemic hits, the first thing that Trump, and Trump is just a name for a regime, right? And so Trump and all the enablers of Trump and the followers of Trump, the first thing that happens is like, my subjecthood has been shattered to pieces because I'm being told not to move freely as I want to move. And this is considered such a blessure, such a wound in the heteropatriarchal cis male normative white adult carnivore warrior subject, that it sets them really in a state of panic. There's a panic, right? And the panic is manifested through counter demonstrations in which the word freedom appears. Because what they don't understand is that the movement is given to them from above, right? It's a transcendent kind of movement, right? The other day I was listening to a live conversation here between a theater director and Marcia Abreu, a Brazilian theater director, Marcia Abreu, and a Brazilian scholar on Afro-Brazilian literature and culture, Leda Martins. And Leda insisted on something that I find super interesting. She said, how is it that Black, Native, Indigenous cultures have an approach to movement that is immanent? There's an immanent relationship to movement, right? And this is where I move to the other side. And I say, okay, so what matters is not freedom as such, but the experimental exercise of immanence. And we can call the experimental exercise of immanence, we can call it freedom, if you want. But what is important is to have an immanent relationship to movement. And the immanent relationship to movement is always an immanent relationship to the collective. And the collective understood as a collective of other human beings, but also non-human entities, the cosmic, the mineral, the atmospheric, right? The viral, right? So that's what I feel like there's a huge battle right now over this notion of freedom of movement and freedom as movement and movement as freedom. And in that divide, like you're quite right to say, like the divide is Cartesian because the properly constituted subject of the West represents itself as a solid, individuated entity, independent, autonomous, individuated, who moves through a kind of Newtonian principle that the only movement that could happen is because an external force has been applied to my body. And the external force could be, like whatever, an ideology or something, right? But it's always an external force that moves my body as such, right? And the only moment that is given to me to exercise my freedom to move is also given to me by capital through the figure of the automobile and the road. So Jacques Rancière has this very interesting notion of the police, and he says the police is also the cop, but the police is a function that says circulate, puts you in a state of circulation, permanent state of circulation. It says circulate, there's nothing to see here, like, which is what the police say. Go, move along, there's nothing to be seen. The move along is the kinetic imperative to the police, to move along, but only in the pathways that the police says that you can move, right? So move along according to the logic of movement that I give you, right? There's nothing to see here. This is the aesthetic aspect of the police. Like, critics, art critics also said when they give bad reviews, there's nothing to see here. Go somewhere else, right? Don't go to this show. Don't see this painting, right? So the police gains this kinetic aesthetic capacity, right? And the problem is that as we do so, there's a kind of incorporation of the freedom of movement, always in response to the police. So the only thing I find, like the flourishing and the outburst of indignation and political action that is happening right now through protests in the United States, which leads to clashes that are deadly, some of them amazingly and incredible and to be continued. At the same time, the police is very intelligent in relationship to what to do with protests and collectives of people. They're super smart. They know everything about not only the body, but also the flesh. The police also understands the logic of the flesh. And they enacted very, very savagely. Savagely. So the thing is, how is it that then we can imagine choreographic movements, choreopolitical movements that keep insisting on the necessity for imminent approaches to the collective?
And elsewhere in your work, you've used the expression, or you've coined the expression, choreopolicing, to speak about these normative constructions of movement. Andre, how do you read the current abolitionist calls for defunding the police, for redistributing public funds across health, education, and housing, within the forms of collective blossoming, within the anti-Black, the anti-Indigenous, and the anti-ecological logics of neoliberalism?
It's like, I'm just a dance scholar, a performance studies scholar, but I would dare to say that I taught a course in 2016 in performance studies called Neoliberalism and its Performances. And we read a bunch of everybody that we could read within a semester to understand the logic of neoliberalism. And what was clear at that moment is that neoliberalism is a form of experimentation that takes its experimentation out of a certain repertoire of the avant-garde of the 60s. And the first one that it takes is a desire to dismantle institutions, right? So the logic of institutional critique that was so important for so many artists and so many movements in the 60s and 70s is captured by neoliberal logic and say, yes, let's destroy institutions, but the institutions we're going to destroy are going to be the governmental institutions, right? And something that neoliberal logic cannot tolerate at all, zero. It's like they cannot give an inch of a possibility of this to be true, is that governance and governments can do something good for the collective, including the self-governance of the collective. I'm not even talking about federal governments. I'm talking about, like you say, like group, like your biennial as a group of people that can govern the, who comes, who goes, like how much to pay, all of that. Like, so, but to think that like a government of the people, a representative government, can do something that is good is something that has to be erased from the collective imagination by neoliberalism, right? And that's why neoliberalism logic only needs the military, the police, and basic infrastructure, Everything else, forget about it. It's not needed, right? So once that happens, the only logic for neoliberalism is authoritarianism. It's not, because democracy is a flourishing from below, always, right? It's always a flourishing from below, always. And that flourishing from below is also called movement. And it's always perpetually flourishing. And that's why, like, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten are super correct in saying, they want to run things, but things are constantly running away. Right? And that's the despair of neoliberalism. And if neoliberalism despair in realizing that it cannot capture every single atom of reality, of existence, the only response is authoritarianism.
Andre, slowly arriving at an end to our conversation. We're at a moment where some institutions will disappear. For better or worse, their activity has come to a tragic halt, and precarious workers in the arts, in culture, have been severely affected by the pandemic, with museums, theaters, and other spaces for seeing and experiencing art obviously being the last to, or often, in a lot of cases, being the last to reopen. I wonder what might we learn from the proximity and the forms of solidarity we've seen enacted during the pandemic, during the protesting, by way of being moved and moving forward.
Well, Sophia, there's like a whole class of workers that are now in an extreme state of precariousness, and that includes the artists and live art performers and technicians and everyone that works in theaters. And I wonder, like, I don't know how to answer this pragmatically, but I wonder how to give an answer that could be perceived as not being smug or pretentious or dismissive. But I'm wondering whether this is really a portal, this moment is really a portal for something else. And if it is a portal for something else, could governments, ministries of culture, corporations, collectives start to reimagine ways in which employment and survival and living could be ensured to all of those professionals? And at the same time, could those professionals, including myself and curators, artists, could start reimagining that there is a distinction between the building of the theater, the buildings, the physical buildings, the physical infrastructure, and the promise of theater, and the stage, the dance stage, and the promise of dance. Right? And whether like it's really a moment to carry those activities elsewhere. I say this with humility and with apologies, because I don't want to dismiss the importance of buildings and the importance of stages and the beautiful, unbelievable, incredible things that happens in those buildings. But if for a few years we need not to be there in order to save others and to save lives, how to imagine with those who are in charge of the money and those who are in charge of the imagination, and the combination between one and the other, to momentarily live art in a different way. Is this making sense somehow? I think it's possible, and I think it happens all the time, constantly. And it's the promise of Gutai, it's the promise of Alan Capro, it's the promise of, right, like to Alicia Clark, Elliot Isika. Like, now maybe we can really get it. Really, maybe it can just be in the streets and bring the lamps and the light designs and the tech and the gear. And if it rains, it just explodes, and that's beautiful. It's just a matter of money. And that's a responsibility for political imagination, what to do with our taxes.
Andre, thank you so much for sharing your longitudinal perspective with us today, from New York City to Rio de Janeiro. It's been an enormous opportunity to unpack the several choreo-political and choreo-policing implications for movement during the pandemic, as well as its ongoing effects on how we move, how we collectively choreograph the minor gestures of the everyday in times of social distancing. So it's early hours for you in Rio, and we wish you a beautiful day. We thank you again for connecting with us. And for our viewers, do join us next week for a talk on the imagination with Tim Ingold. Thank you, everyone.